I ended up doing 5 sub-internships, which I wouldn't recommend.
Why wouldn't you recommend the amount of sub-internships that you did somebody
So
else? Like, what was the challenge there?
Hello, and welcome to the Med School Years podcast. I'm Dina.
And I'm Carlos, where we talk about everything you need to know about the medical school journey and residency.
We've both worked closely with applicants, advisors, and schools to understand the ins and outs of what it takes to get into med school. And now we're going beyond the admissions process.
And don't worry, this podcast isn't just about the boring stuff. We're also going to give you a behind-the-scenes look at the life of medical school students and residents.
We know that medical school can be overwhelming, but we're here to break it all down for you with expert tips, insider advice, and stories from people and students who've been there.
So whether you're starting the exploration process or just curious about what it takes to becoming a future physician, we got you covered.
Sit back, relax, and welcome to the Med School Years podcast. Welcome to the Med School Years podcast. I'm Dina Galini. I am one of the advisors here at Medical School Headquarters, joined with my colleague, Carlos Tapia. And today we are interviewing Gersham. He is a neurosurgery resident at USF Morsani. He attended Providence College for undergrad, went to med school at Drexel, and he is in his second year of residency in one of the most competitive specialties in medicine. So we're super excited to interview him today and thank him for being here. Carlos, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Carlos here, joining Dina today. Happy to be here, talk about all the fun stuff in medical school residency. So welcome. Yeah.
So Gersham, tell us a little bit about your journey. I know you and I know each other from our days back in Rhode Island. You went to a liberal arts school for undergrad, and Drexel for medical school.
Yep.
So talk to me a little bit about what that journey was like. And did you feel prepared for medical school coming out of a small liberal arts school? And at what point at Drexel did you think, I think I want to go into neurosurgery?
Yeah, so obviously started off at Cranston West in Rhode Island. I was a 3-sport athlete there. I did relatively well in all my courses. I wanted to stay close to home for college. That's kind of why I picked Providence College. They also had a kind of a blossoming sciences program, and I ended up majoring in chemistry while I was there. And so, after that, ended up going to Drexel Medical School. I had a couple of interviews for med school, got into 3 or 4 different programs, chose Drexel because Philadelphia is a pretty awesome hub to be able to see some pretty diverse things. And then it's actually kind of funny. So it was during the last week that I possibly could have to decide what specialty I wanted to do is when I decided on neurosurgery over internal medicine, which is kind of a complete 180, but it was one of those things that just kind of happened. Had a couple of eye-opening experiences where I was just like, you know what, I think this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, and had a lot of experiences after that kind of confirmed it. And then obviously went through the whole interview process for residency, which obviously you rank programs that you interview at based on what your preference is. And I got lucky enough to end up at the number 1 program on my list at University of South Florida. And so I'm nearing the end of my second year there, where I'm currently doing the majority of my call responsibilities and, gradually get to transition to an operative resident at that point. But I really feel like, coming from a liberal arts college, it gives you the opportunity to be the big fish in a small pond and really stand out for people. And I think that's one of the things that's really, really underestimated, because people, they want to stay at, big state universities and, make friends and do all that stuff. And that's great. But sometimes it's a little harder with a lot bigger courses to really stand out, which is why I really enjoyed the experience at Providence College, because my classes were pretty intimate. There were some of my classes where it was 8 to 10 students, and you get to really know the professors. They get to really know you. They get to really know your work ethic. So I think that part of the application process was a little bit easier for me, because I think the people that were writing me my letters of recommendation really knew me well.
Yeah. So you talked about doing this pivot, right, from internal medicine to neurosurgery.
Yep.
In the last possible minute, I'd imagine. Can you just explain that, knowing that you were prepping to go into internal medicine? I'm sure you had letters, personal statement, and all of a sudden you're like, nope, I need to restart all over again.
Yep.
Can you walk us through how that played out?
Yeah. So, at the end of the day, like our last week of third year, you're supposed to like kind of put a stamp of approval, like, okay, this is what I want to do. And so it was actually like a week or two before that, as part of my neurology rotation, I got to go and spend time with one of the neurosurgeons at the place that I rotated at out in York, Pennsylvania. And I just had some eye-opening experiences there that like really opened my eyes and said, hey, like, not that other specialties don't make a difference in people's lives and don't save lives, but to me, for neurosurgery is like, every single operation that you do, you're manipulating the substances that make people who they are. And to me, there's nothing more rewarding. And to be honest, at least to me, there's no bigger responsibility in all of medicine than people going under anesthesia saying, hey, please make me wake up the same person, or please help me to get back to where I am. Like, I think one of the cases from my first year that really stood out to me. We had a gentleman who had a pretty large herniated disc in his neck that was pushing on some of the nerves and was affecting his hands. And he was a musician by trade, and so obviously he couldn't play the guitar, which was really affecting his livelihood. He obviously you need to be able to make money to survive, and we were able to kind of give him that function back. And to me, that was like something where I was like, okay, yeah, this is really what I want to do for the rest of my life. But making the pivot was difficult, in terms of like getting all the paperwork together. Just took a couple extra hours, taking a couple extra hours of sleep at night that, get taken away. But to me, it was all totally worth it.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I was pulling some stats before we hopped on today at, the number of neurosurgery spots from 2024. There was 241 and only 8 in the state of Florida, which is where you are, which is even worse from Rhode Island, where we're from. There's only 2,
Right.
which is crazy, right? But only 8. I mean, and we have 22 million people in the state, but that's not a lot, right? So talk to me a little bit about the stress of applying into such a competitive residency, a specialty, because it's pretty competitive.
Yeah. So I think over the course of the last couple of years, I think it goes back and forth between neurosurgery, plastics, and ortho, between the most like competitive specialties to match into, at least from what I've seen from the data. For neurosurgery, it's tough. It's a really tight-knit field. I was reading a statistic the other day that actually one of the members of our department shared with me. It's like you're more likely to either play in the NFL or be involved in the NFL tree than you are to be in the field of neurosurgery. And I think that kind of speaks to how competitive of a specialty that it is. But I think in terms of like navigating it and navigating how stressful it is, I think one of the things that people get bogged down with are like, oh, I need to have, I can only have like A++ grades. I need to have only A++ test scores. Like, granted, you need to do well on all of your exams and all the standardized testing and all that stuff. But I think what really made me stand out, made the interview process a little bit easier, was just like being myself during interviews. Like, I brought a lot of that like kind of Rhode Island Italian charm to it. I talked about cooking in a lot of my interviews, and I talked about playing sports in a lot of my interviews, because sports were such a big part of my life growing up. And even at Providence College when I was playing club sports and that sort of thing, like just stuff that I kind of stayed in touch with. I think staying true to all the things that I really enjoyed was important for the process. Like, even when I was studying for my board exams and stuff like that, I tried to make it a point where one day a week, I would just go out and play golf. I would go out and, just do things that I enjoy, or like go out and try different foods. I think that is so important to like grounding you in the application process and like really following through with those things too. Like, even when I was at Drexel, we had like community involvement for like, youth sports groups and stuff like that. And those are things that I got involved with because it was stuff that made me happy. And, it's stuff that looks good on the application, but it like kind of kept me grounded and just didn't keep me too stressed.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really insightful into sort of how you entered this profession and how you sought this out, and you understood the competitive nature of the specialty that you were going into. I have a 2-pronged question for you, and the question is, one is very simple. How many programs did you actually apply to? Because I think we get that question a lot. It's like, how many do I apply to get some return?
Yep.
But what do you feel was the most challenging part of this process? Was it crafting an application, crafting a personal statement? So tell us about that from your perspective.
So I think in terms of the number of programs that I applied to, I think there's 115 or 117, something along those lines, for a number of neurosurgery programs in the country. I applied to 100 of them. I had interview offers at about like 30, and then I took 20 of them. And in terms of what the most challenging part of the process is, I think it's trying to figure out what stuff you want to put on your application to try to make you stand out that you can still talk about. I think some of the traps that people fall into are putting stuff on their application that they were just like kind of involved with, but not really like immersed in. I can say, at least from my experiences, like talking to people that were interviewing for residency, I think one of the, not necessarily red flags, but one of the things that kind of like raises an eyebrow or two is like, you know, you put something on your application, you can't really talk too much about it. So I really only included stuff on my application that I was passionate about and could like sit and talk for 10-15 minutes about, rather than just like loading my application up to increase the number of like publications or posters or activities that I had. I think it's definitely one of those situations where it's quality over quantity.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. I think we share that a lot with even pre-health students, right? Like include things in your application that you can really talk about. Don't put these surface experiences that you think are going to make you stand out.
Right.
And then when asked, you're going to have a very challenging time answering a question about it.
Awkward silence in the interview.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You, for Drexel, a lot of the clerkships, the rotations are not like you can leave Philadelphia, correct?
That's what I did.
Which is very unique for, you know, there's a handful of medical schools you can do that. I think because Drexel got rid of their affiliated hospital years ago, if I'm correct. So talk to me about that experience and choosing to do those rotations in another state.
Yeah.
Where you did them.
So what I did, so Drexel lost Hahnemann Hospital going into my first year. So we lost our major rotating like center, like our major academic affiliate hospital, like going into first year. So it was kind of a scramble to find different like places to be able to go. So I ended up in York, Pennsylvania, doing all of my third year rotations and then some of my core fourth year rotations. And I think what made me choose York was, I think it was, again, that like small, intimate setting, trying to be a big fish in a small pond so people can know you really well. It was one of those rotation sites that took less students than some of the other ones, where, you know, you only have one or two other students rotating on a service with you at a time. So it helps you to like stand out and like, it's a lot easier to interact with people as well. I also liked the population that's in York, which is kind of out in like the Amish country out over there. It's a lot different than the population that you would see in Philadelphia as well. And then as a fourth year, we get to choose like where we want to rotate as a sub intern. And that was kind of dependent on what I wanted out of a program. I wanted a more blue collar program where I could get my hands dirty and, you know, really enhance my operating skills as early on as possible. I mean, I like research. I like participating in research, but I didn't really want to like do a place that was a huge academic powerhouse where they devote like 1 or 2 years to research. I wanted somewhere where I could like really get my hands dirty. And I rotated at places that were like a reflection of that. I ended up doing 5 sub-internships, which I wouldn't recommend. But I rotated at different places that I felt were like really blue collar places that really got me involved. And again, places that I could rotate and like really like make my mark and have people remember me.
Why wouldn't you recommend the amount of sub-internships that you did somebody else? Like, what was the challenge there?
I think it's just the sheer number of them, 5 sub-internships, because it's essentially a month-long interview that you're spending there. And it's just the hours are tough because, you know, you want to show that you have the work ethic to be able to hang and be able to, you know, deal with all the stuff that a neurosurgeon has to deal with, which is tough. The cases are long, the call hours are tough, but I think 5 is a bit too many. I think the majority of people recommend doing 3 sub-internships. Because that's good enough to get you the number of letters of recommendation that you need. I just came from the disadvantage of us losing Hahnemann Hospital. So I didn't have a home program. So I wanted to be able to reach out to more people, have more people be able to kind of go to bat for me when it came time to apply for residency and interview.
Was one of those sub-internships at University of South Florida?
Surprisingly, no. A lot of people end up matching at places that they rotate at. I did not rotate at University of South Florida. I rotated at Medical University of South Carolina. I rotated at Baylor. I rotated at University of Texas Southwestern. I rotated at Allegheny General Hospital, and I also rotated at Chester Crozier Hospital, which is, I guess, it's a Rutgers affiliate now.
Perfect.
So how'd you choose Morsani? I mean, you're at the hub, right? Like Florida's largest academic medical center. It's pretty big.
Yeah.
Why was it your top choice?
So I think what really like swayed me to put them as number one on my list was my interactions with all of the faculty and the current residents that were there when I interviewed. It just like it felt like I was at home. Like everybody was like, you know, pretty jovial and like laughing and joking around with one another. It wasn't too serious of an environment, but it seemed like they really cared about what they did. I think so. Our department chair is Dr. Harry Van Loveren, who's like one of the fathers of modern day skull based neurosurgery, and just like talking with him just felt like it just felt so easy, and he made me feel at home during my interview with him. And then I got to interview with my future chiefs as well, and just being able to talk with them and see like, okay, these are the people who I'm going to be directly with, the majority of my days that I'm on call. It gave me a good sense of like, okay, this is a program who cares about their patients, who cares about neurosurgery, but also like they're really people outside of neurosurgery. They're not entirely bogged up in a career that some people can end up getting bogged up in.
Yeah. I think like from everything that you're saying and just knowing you from when you were, a teenager, right? You've always stayed true to who you are. And even when you're talking about selecting like a neurosurgery residency, you're gravitating towards people who you feel like are real and where you can be your best self. And I think that authenticity sometimes is lost in the whole medical school admissions process. I mean, we're reviewing applications constantly. I mean, I read so many applications during my time at Stanford, and you see students who are just like so metrics oriented, locked in a library, publications, and they forget to be real. And I think that's an important message.
Yeah, I think it's so important to just like, and there's people who love research, who love academics. There's always a spot for them too. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, but to me, I'd rather go somewhere where I can like sit and like talk about sports with someone for 45 minutes rather than just like sit there and talk about research for 45 minutes.
I think I want to follow up on that because you mentioned something, sort of your story, your journey, your rotations of leaving, right? This big academic hub, big city, going somewhere else to do your rotations, and now being in another sort of big academic hub. And the myth that's out there that in order for you to gain a position in a very, sort of heavy specialty, you need to remain in these large academic centers. And I feel like your story is sort of counters that narrative. Can you tell me sort of like your experience? Because I'm sure you're around other residents that maybe went to big academic centers, right? And you come from like, no, I did my clerkship rotations in a small community hospital,
right?
But I'm here now.
Yeah, and there's definitely residents in my program, and like residents at other programs that I made friends with along the way on my sub internships who went to these big academic programs in these gigantic cities. They're in huge research hubs. I think the common denominator between us is that we all pursued things that we found interesting and didn't just do things to like put on our application. I can't emphasize the importance of that enough because, at the end of the day, when you're in an interview with someone, you get like 25, 30 minutes to talk with them. Sometimes it's as little as 15 minutes, but like being able to talk about something that you're passionate about is huge. Like one of my friends is up at OHSU in Oregon, and he's super passionate about like computer programming. Like he loves that sort of stuff. He like writes his own code and all that. And so he was able to bond with a bunch of people that he interviewed with, like just talk about computers, talk about AI, talk about that sort of stuff. And I think, the majority of his projects that he put on his application were about that too. And I think it's staying true to that side of you that you find interesting is, I think that means the world to people that interview you. Because it shows that you're a person outside of medicine. Because at the end of the day, that's what keeps you sane with the amount of hours that you work, the amount of serious cases that you have to deal with, the amount of complications that there are. I think being able to have something outside of medicine is incredibly important.
And it makes you human, and patients love that. Right? Patients, to build those longitudinal relationships, patients gravitate towards doctors like you.
Right.
What was one of the biggest shocks for you adjusting to residency coming from med school?
I think the amount of responsibility that they give you right off the bat. I think it's one of those things where, you get an orientation, you get you get a set number of patients for the first week or so, but then like after that, it's like, okay, like you're a doctor now, like you'll be able to figure these things out. You have to look things up. You have to talk to people. You have to look at the guidelines. I think the amount of work that you have to put in at the beginning of residency to get adjusted is definitely a shock. But once you get used to it, it becomes second nature. But I think the initial amount of work you have to put in to be able to kind of guide yourself in the right direction was definitely a shock.
Different change, different pace, different everything, right? Medical school. And even, right, think about your pre-health journey. You enter medical school, that was a totally different experience. And now you enter residency, and that's a totally different experience.
Right.
But I want to think back to when you were a medical school student and even, right, a pre-health student. What, if anything, did you carry forward from sort of pre-health to medical school to residency? Because I think sometimes students think it's very isolated, but I feel it's something that you carry with you, right? There's certain things, and I think Dina talked about your own personality carrying that through. But what other things, experiences that you felt like these are beneficial from pre-health to med school to residency?
Actually, I think one of the most important things was something that I really got the hang of in high school was like figuring out what your role is in a team. I think me playing 3 sports in high school was like integral to that, and like figuring out where you fit and how you can move the team forward is incredibly important. So I think that was a skill from high school that I brought to college, that I brought to medical school, that I bring to residency. And I think that one's incredibly important. I think the other things are communication skills, being able to effectively try to portray what it is that you're thinking and portray the type of themes that you want to. I think that's important as well. And that's something that I kind of developed along the way as a pre-med student and as a med student, that you just kind of get better at it over time. It's difficult with, and the actual pathologies and the source material, it's difficult. The STEM field is, highly regarded for a reason. And I think it's because of the difficulty behind like what actually goes on. I think being able to convey that is important. I think some of the other skills that I learned, especially, along the way, is that you have to be adaptable. Like how you study is adaptable. I used to be more of I like read something and then I'm perfectly fine. I can internalize it. But then I started to become more of like a visual learner once I started getting into body systems and stuff like that. So being able to adapt the way that you learn is important as well. And then I think foremost is organizational skills. I can't tell you how many people I know that got to where they are because of how organized they are, and they stay to like strict to a schedule and stay strict to, okay, this is what I'm doing on this thing and this is how I'm going to do it. I think those are some of the pillars that kind of got me to where I am, that I've like kind of fine-tuned and adjusted along the way.
So
it's funny because, I think back to my time, a long time ago, being a high school counselor, and you encounter students every year that are like, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a doctor. And I can literally in my entire career count on one hand how many students have actually gone to med school, and it's always the ones who didn't necessarily say, I want to be a doctor. Right. And I think that that's really important, to hear you say, like, being part of teams really played a big role, because I feel like it's all those students that weren't really an integral part of teams or community, that were, so focused on academics that didn't end up pursuing medicine. But it's the students that have a really holistic kind of experience that end up succeeding. Like, if you had to give any advice to like 17-year-old Gersham, what would it be at this point?
If I had to give a piece of advice to 17-year-old Gersham, I'd probably say, it's actually a tough question,
isn't it?
I think the biggest piece of advice would be listen to your dad. I'll tell you why. So my dad is a man of like infinite wisdom. He's a guy who's seen the world. He's a guy who's been through it all, but he always told me to just absolutely stay true to who you are. Don't change who you are for anybody. Keep that going forward. My dad is one of my biggest role models in my life. And I think, his advice where he said, just be you. I think that's something that I think if I kept carrying it forward, I think it leads me in good places in life. And I think that's the advice that I would still echo to this day.
That's great advice. And it's something we give students all the time that's often missing. right? When you're applying for medical school, applying for residency, they're always students. A lot of times, are trying to be someone they think that programs want to see, and they don't. Not necessarily. Again, back to that authenticity. Make that shine. So that's sweet, and it's an important message. Dad must be very proud.
Oh yeah.
And I'm sure that you brought that to the interview experience, right, in residency, like you did in med school.
Yep.
Was there anything that you can recall that you remember, sort of like positives and negatives about the interview process for neuro?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, you bring yourself, right? But what else?
I think in terms of my positive experiences were just people who were, kind of like-minded individuals like myself, people who, I didn't come from like a medical background. A lot of people who apply into neurosurgery, and a lot of people in medicine in general, have some sort of medical background in their family, with somebody being a doctor. But I didn't really have that. And I feel like a lot of the people that I talked to, I was able to relate to on that sort of level. Being able to talk about sports, being able to talk about just like American literature, cinema, that sort of stuff, like being able to talk about those things were definitely some of the positive. I think the negatives, in terms of at least my interview experience when I was interviewing for residency, I think, there's always going to be one or two people at every program who like kind of put on like a stoic face and are just like, oh, you're not going to phase me, you're not going to break me, like that sort of thing. I think that's definitely one of the negatives, because it's still out there. It's not as much as it had previously been in the medical field, but at least it's one of those things where people try to almost try to trick you. One of the scenarios that I didn't really like on interviews is like with them like trying to test your medical knowledge. I had that in one or two of my interviews, and I was just like, I wish it was a little bit more laid back than that. But other than that, I think the majority of my interview experiences were pretty good.
Like a pop quiz in the moment, like tell me about this.
Yeah, or like pulling up like an image on their computer and being like, what does this look like to you? And I'm like, I didn't come here for a test.
Wow.
Let me guess. Did you rank those programs, or did you not decide?
I ranked them, but I put them more towards the bottom.
Yeah. It's good to hear. Again, if you didn't find it comfortable during the interview, right? As much as they're interviewing you, you're also learning more about the program and interviewing them. At the end of the day, once you get into residency, you're pretty much there until you complete it.
Right.
So it would be very disadvantaged to you to be somewhere that you were just maybe feeling the vibes were off, or just not aligning with sort of who you are and your personality. So it's good to know. Yeah.
Now that you're in neurosurgery residency, is there any specific path for neurosurgery that you're really interested in?
I mean, I like spine. Spine is pretty interesting. But I mean, like the cranial stuff is absolutely fascinating as well. And it's like they're almost two separate worlds inside of neurosurgery that constantly get separated. But I think being able to do both of them is pretty cool. But I think in terms of the spine stuff, it feels like, in a lot of my summers back when, I was at Providence College, I spent it doing like demolition and contracting work. And a lot of the spine stuff feels like carpentry. And so that's why I'm leaning more towards doing a spine heavy practice, but we'll see. I still have some time.
I love that. I find a lot of people who go into surgery in general, but more specific like plastics, ortho, neurosurgery, say something similar where they just want to go in and fix something.
Yep.
Right? That it's so different from like primary care, internal medicine, that they love that idea of something's broken, let me go in and fix it. It's very compartmentalized.
So what additional training do you think you're going to need to be able to do that? Or is it just getting out of residency and then like, what's your plan? Private practice, big practice?
So I think all neurosurgery residencies are 7 years long. And I think for the majority of people, that's enough training for you to be able to get a job just about the majority of places that you would want. I'm doing 2 enfolded fellowships during my 5th year. I'm doing a deformity spine fellowship, and then I'm also doing an endoscopic spine fellowship for each one for half the year. Think about potentially doing another fellowship in MIS spine surgery afterwards, or maybe spine onc. I'm not really too sure at this point, but potentially an extra year training on top of that. But it's all stuff that I'm interested in, and I think that stuff kind of like propels you forward for being able to handle anything that kind of comes through the door.
So fellowship, your applications again for competitive specialties, and fellowships. Are you ready to do this all over again?
Yeah, and I think I think once our call responsibilities kind of lighten up after our second year, you know, we were able to find that kind of spare time to be able to really fine tune our applications and participate in more research and get a little bit more involved with everything.
Okay. You bring up something interesting because I've seen this now in the pre-health world, specifically this sort of increase in research activity, right?
Yep.
I know that for residency, there's some specialties that are very research heavy, and they sort of, there's an unwritten rule that they expect to see this.
Yep.
What was your research experience, and did you feel that you needed research to be able to sort of be competitive in neurosurgery?
Yeah, I think neurosurgery in and of itself is a field that's kind of driven forward by the research that goes on. Like everything's driven by the guidelines, or like, oh, hey, you know, the majority of papers agree on this for, you know, X, Y, or Z pathology. I think it's such an evidence-based field that's based on clinical research and outcomes that I think, you know, demonstrating that you can see a project to its completion and participate and contribute to the literature, it becomes important. Now, having like a huge number of publications, to be honest, doesn't really matter too much. I think it's, you know, at least for me, reviewing applicants, it's more of a, can you see a project to its completion? And I think that's important.
How much research did you have in your app?
I had probably about 15 separate projects, but I only had like 6 publications. Now, a lot of them were like works in progress because I started so late, but I probably had about 15, 16 research experiences, had about 6 publications, and probably about like 10, 15 posters.
Okay. Wow, that's extensive.
How about applying to med school? Did you get a lot of research in undergrad at Providence College?
I did. I did organic chemistry research for 4 years. Ended up getting a couple of poster presentations out of that, 1 or 2 publications. So you don't need an incredible amount to apply into medical school. I think when people are looking at research from the medical school perspective, it's, again, that can you see a project to its completion sort of thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
I always give that advice to students when they ask about research. Like, you don't necessarily need it, but nobody wants to teach you how to do research when you walk in the door of medical school.
Right.
They want to make sure that you can follow through with the project.
Right.
How did you fit research into your medical school years? Like, where did it all fit in?
So it's tough. It's kind of finding those couple of hours of spare time. You know, sometimes people just ask you, hey, do you want to work on a research project? And sometimes it's as simple as that. I feel like the majority of my projects actually came from like me just either being in the operating room with someone or me, like, you know, rounding with someone on the wards and them saying, I was researching this, but like, I don't have time to do it. You're a med student. Do you want to help? And I was just like, yeah, sure. Why not? And then just fitting in some extra time. And I think staying organized is like another integral part of that too, because I'm a big checklist person. So I start every single day with writing my to-do list, with a whole bunch of check boxes on it. And if I can get to it, you know, I try to be able to get to it. Like, hey, I want to get this much done on this project today. Like, even if you just chip away at small things, perfectly fine. And then every once in a while you'll run into the, hey, like, we need this done by the end of the week. And then you make it a priority. But I think chipping away at a bunch of small projects is useful too, because you're kind of training your brain like, okay, I can switch back and forth between these things. I understand what's going on between them and I can still advance them forward.
Awesome. No additional year for research. You did 4 years med school. Oh, wow. Yep. Okay.
Just went straight through. I went straight through from undergrad to med school, and then straight through from med school to neurosurgery residency.
Which is hard to do for direct entry. Very hard to do now. Just because the applicant pool is so diverse at this point.
Right.
I think last year, I just saw the stats from AMCAS. The oldest matriculant to med school was 55. So
wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah. So that brings up another question, right? Like, now that you were in residency, what is the mix like?
I mean,
right? Are you with a lot of residents that are older, around your age?
Yeah, it's especially in neurosurgery, it's a mixed bag. There's people who do MD PhDs that go into it too. There's people like me who went straight through. Like, even though I'm coming to the end of my second year, I'm still our youngest resident. And like, people come from all sorts of walks of life. They take multiple research years. They go on mission trips. They do all sorts of things. So I think at least neurosurgery and a lot of the surgical specialties in general, you get a pretty mixed bag of where people are in life.
Yeah, I think that's hard to get. I know for us, like, you know, advising students, it's often hard to get that across, especially to students that are still in college and they want direct entry.
Right.
You know, it's it's just.
I think a good piece of advice is that it's okay if you don't get into medical school your first time around, and it's okay if you don't especially if you need to take a couple of research years or you need to work for a couple of years. All of that stuff is okay. You can make it work out in the long run.
Yeah.
Awesome. I have a follow-up question because, again, right now you chose neurosurgery, you were internal medicine, and at any point in the process, were you a dual applicant to two specialties, or were you just like, I'm putting everything on neuro and I'm going full on?
I put in all my effort into one specialty, and like I would highly recommend that for people. I know some people are torn between specialties, but I think at least looking at the statistics, like if you apply to multiple specialties, statistically you're less likely to match into the more competitive specialty that is normally what people want. They usually apply to dual specialties either because they're torn between the two or they're just not sure how competitive their application is. My recommendation would be I would just stick with one. At least that's also the advice that I've gotten from people in the field as well. They were just like, I stuck with one, and it's one of the better decisions that I've made.
That's a good strategy.
It is a good strategy. Were there any rotations that you did in medical school where you were like, immediately, you were like, this is not for me. I cannot see myself as like a pediatrician or hematologist or anything like that?
I was going to say that one was actually at pediatrics for me. Because for me, it's like you're dealing with a patient population who can't necessarily express what's wrong with them, and you're dependent on another individual. Sometimes parents can be a little bit overbearing with their kids, and like rightfully so, right? Like it's their child; they want to make sure that their child is healthy and okay. But sometimes people don't understand where the line is, where they're overstepping. And that was one thing that I noticed continually happened in my pediatrics rotations, where people just like constantly crossing that line. And I was just like, I don't know if I would want to deal with this.
It's frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was neurosurgery or internal medicine, and then went to neuro. What other specialties were you considering?
I thought about ortho for a little bit because I thought the spine was pretty interesting. But one of the things for me was that I saw there's a lot of data that show that the majority of spine cases are now done by neurosurgeons regardless. So I think that was one of the things that kind of jumped out at me. Even though like the orthopedic folks, they do a lot of the pediatric deformity, and they still do a lot of deformity spine. But it was the other aspect of it. It was decided between like joints versus doing surgery on the brain, and for me the brain stuff was much more interesting.
Did you ever take the length of time into consideration? Like, you're going to be in training for 7 years. It's like, when am I going to actually be a doctor?
Right. It's definitely one of the things that I thought about, but at the same time, like I was going into residency so young, and like I'm still our youngest resident. So for me, it didn't end up being too much of an issue. For some people that are a little bit older, it might be, but I mean, at least for me, it was pretty good.
Well, I mean, you've given us so much of your time. I think we're so grateful.
No problem.
I have one last really important question. Now that you live in Tampa, I hope that you're not a Buccaneers fan and that you're still a Patriots fan.
Nope. No Bucks for me.
Okay. Good. I was a little worried about that.
Don't worry.
I'm so proud of you.
True to himself. True to himself, right? True to himself. That hasn't changed.
Yep.
Yeah. You're amazing. Your story is just very inspiring. You're just so real and so authentic, and you're going to save lives and make such a big difference in the world.
Thank you. That's the hope.
And I think that just the information you've given us today is going to help so many aspiring students who are applying to residency, who are in med school and like trying to decide what to do and how to do it. So we thank you for that.
No problem.
And I think it'll help also pre-health students. I think we get a lot of students that come to the table thinking like, I know what I'm going to do, right? Once I graduate, and I need to explain that. And we sometimes have to tell them to be like, your priority right now is getting into medical school, not what you're going to do after medical school. So it's pointless. Plus, data shows that by the time you enter medical school and you're almost done, you switch specialties anyway. Point in case, right? Internal medicine all of a sudden do a flip to neurosurgery.
Right.
And success story. So it's amazing. Yeah. Good
Awesome.
job. Good
Thanks
job.
for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good job. Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. I know you're on spring break. I hope you get some time to decompress. Enjoy.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you so much.
No problem.